This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential. Today we're going to cover the book Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Some of us think a little more quickly than others, and some of us slow things down and think maybe a little bit more precisely. Some of us do both. Daniel Kahneman tells us how it all works. So, Eric, who recommended this book?
A gentleman by the name of Jason A. Staples, doctor.
Yeah, I did recommend this book, didn't I?
Derek Sivers recommended it on episode 202 of the Tim Ferriss podcast. But this was one of the 5 books that Jason actually that you recommended to me. I asked for you to send me 5 books you thought it would be good for me to read, and this is the first one on the list for this year. So I'm actually curious as to why this one, and had you read it before?
I had not read this before, but I knew a lot of the book from a lot of my own training, and also from listening to Daniel Kahneman being interviewed, and tons of other work, and reading and listening to stuff from the field of behavioral psychology, and also behavioral economics, the psychology of judgment, decision making, and logical fallacies, and all this stuff. A lot of the stuff that I've spent a good amount of time on over the last few years intersects with Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and that whole group of that whole circle of people around them. And this book is, of course, basically the magnum opus, the big summary of much of his research, and has been pretty widely discussed since its release in 2011. And so I was very familiar with the book, but it was one that I'd wanted to read for a while in order to not just have familiarity with it, but to be pretty fluent in it.
Okay. And then why did you suggest it for me?
Well, I mean, again, this is one of those books that I think most people should read, even though there's some things in there that I don't agree with, and that I think we need to be careful about overconfidence, actually. And that's one of the things that he emphasizes in this book is we have to be very rigorous about how we study things. Even where in some details, I think the experimental data has not always held up. There's certain things in terms of conclusions that we'll talk about actually later in the show that haven't held up. By and large, the warnings in terms of how people think and how we think, how everyone who shares human flesh and human nature tends to think, they do a really good job. He and his circle have done a really good job, and this book does a really good job of boiling down how people process. And if we understand where we are liable to make mental errors, where we tend to misunderstand statistics, where we tend to be overconfident, all sorts of different things, basic natural illusions, both in terms of the senses and in terms of thinking. All of that stuff is really valuable for decision making, for understanding how to better live life. And so I think that this is and to run a business and all these other things. And I think this is one of those books that does a really good job of providing a lot of warnings to say, you have these tendencies. We all have these tendencies, and we should be aware of them. And I think that's really useful.
Yeah. And to go into a quick overview for anyone who hasn't read the book, it's really divided into 3 parts, where the first part talks about system 1 versus system 2, and that's the fast and the slow. So system 1 refers to fast thinking, system 2 to the slower thinking.
Yeah, and more specifically, system 1 being what we would tend to call intuition. intuitive thinking, the sort of thinking without thinking, the natural judgments that we all make without ever having to process that those judgments are happening. That's system one.
And also unconscious versus conscious in a way. And I'm really glad he didn't use those terms, and that he didn't use terms that most people use to discuss these things, because talking about it as system one and system two actually just kind of helped you think about it in a new way, and not go to everything that you've read or learned about unconscious versus conscious before. It kind of removed the baggage of that and just helped it, in my mind at least, helped it to kind of be fresh.
Yeah, it's not just fresh. It also makes it pretty neutral in terms of value. It's value neutral. So it's not a matter of like, unconscious thinking, there may be a little bit of a negative valence to that versus, conscious thinking. No, this is just the way things tend to work, the way people tend to operate. And I think that's useful as well. I actually liked that, even though he got some criticism for that. I think it was the right decision.
Yeah. Section 2 goes into kind of a humorous part of econs versus humans, and econs being what anyone who's taken Econ 101, the rational person, how they behave rationally in every circumstance. So he compares a rational person, which doesn't exist, to humans. And if you look at the back of this book, it says psychology and economics, and he won the Nobel Prize for economics, and then The Economist in 2015 listed him as the 7th most influential economist in the world. So it's a deeply psychology related book, but it's like the economics are what really hit home too. And he really takes on the field of economics, a lot of the base assumptions and that sort of thing. And, they're discussed in other places, but I was surprised at the level that it went to in this book. So that we'll discuss that more. That was section 2. Section 3 then goes into how we remember the past, and in two versions again of our remembering self versus our experiencing self. So those are the 3 divisions of the book, and then he has a nice little tidy tie up at the end where he discusses these again. But that's how the book is divided up.
And actually, while you were talking about that, one of the things that actually came to mind, and there's going to be a number of places in this podcast where I'm gonna want to connect Kahneman's case or Kahneman's perspective into a dialogue with Nassim Taleb and his work. Obviously, in the book itself, Kahneman actually mentions Taleb's work on statistics and so on, and has a lot of respect for how he handles randomness and all of this. That fooled by randomness is what he's mostly interacting with. But actually, there's Taleb's latest work in some ways actually pushes against some of the things that behavioral economics and Kahneman and that school of thought push. So, for example, one of the things that you mentioned is rationality, and Homo economicus is that what he calls econs. That fictional individual is that people are not actually rational. That they're rarely rational is kind of the case of a lot of behavioral economists now, and psychologists as well, that people are not rational. And there's a lot of discussion in this book about how people are not making rational decisions. That, if you evaluate this decision versus this decision, then clearly it's irrational, etc. Taleb actually in Anti-Fragile and in Skin in the Game, which is his latest bit, in Skin in the Game in particular, he has some discussion of and some critique of the concept of rationality. And there's some discussion of this actually, and we'll link to it in a recent econ talk with Russ Roberts, where he says he notes, he says, I thought about what I'm quoting Taleb now. I thought about what he was saying and how people define rationality, and that went back to how people express what they call rational. And I noticed that And I noticed that that is usually ex ante. Hence non-empirical definition of rationality. Ex ante means that I define an action as being irrational. It means that you know everything that is going to go on around that action. In other words, that your model represents the world. And we've known ever since Herbert Simon that his other rationality, that effectively that you will never be able to build a model that can understand the world. So when I say an action is irrational ex ante, beforehand, I'd better have a track record of that action, because we need to see if it's maybe because there are some things that there are things that are not included in that model. So if I say that it's irrational to prefer A to B or B to C, but not C to A, I'd better have a good model that holds in the real world. That's called the transitivity condition. And I've argued in Anti-Fragile, he says, that if you expand the model to saying that for an individual, it may make sense to be coherent, but collectively we cannot operate what's coherent individually, because you deplete resources. For example, if you always prefer tuna to steaks, you would deplete the tuna supply. So you need to cycle. So he basically says nature makes you randomly change preferences, and that's not irrational, even though changing preferences is often by behaviorists or by the behavioral school. Behaviorist, I'm sorry, is a totally different thing. But by the behavioral school of economics is regarded as irrational. And Taleb is actually saying, well, maybe there's something deeper in here that's missed by a more fossil surface level understanding of rationality. So I actually think Taleb's latest work, and there are a few other things, are a nice counterbalance to what I think is very valuable work here from Kahneman. So I think that's worth pairing together with this, and we should put that up front.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, we'll definitely link to those things. And his Skin in the Game book is getting quite a bit of play out there.
Well, he's brilliant. So
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So Kahneman, real quick, born in 1934 in Mandatory Palestine in Tel Aviv, before the state of Israel, and was in Paris during World War II. He is Jewish, and so that was problematic. They did get out of there and ended up being in Israel in 1948 at the creation of the state of Israel. He teaches at Princeton.
He's emeritus now, so he's not teaching anymore.
Oh, okay.
But yeah.
Okay. But closely associated with that. Went to Berkeley in the late 80s, early 90s, and you mentioned his partner in crime, Amos Tversky, who unfortunately passed away, but he is discussed a lot in this book, and the two of them worked together for many years and did some great work together. So this is one of the books for 2018 that both Jason and I read, and so we're going to discuss it in that way, and instead of one of us interviewing the other about it. So we'll start out like we have in the past with our initial reactions. And so, Jason, what was your initial reaction of the book?
Well, I mean, this is one of the books that I have the most positive initial reaction to in terms of some of the ones that we've read. Certainly one of the better ones, I think. It is a little bit mixed in that, first of all, I mean, the book is pretty long. So, I mean, whoever's gonna read it, you're gonna have to commit to taking some time to read this.
Well, long and dense.
Yeah, it's well. I mean, I guess from my perspective, it's not as dense as given the stuff that I'm normally reading, but yeah.
Compared to the other books of Titans books. Yeah,
compared to the other books of Titans books, it's maybe a little dense, and it's certainly long. But again, I think this is one of those books that is valuable for anybody to read. It's one of those books that I think would be very valuable as mandatory reading for high school students, because it's the kind of thing that we need to understand where our psychological weaknesses are, where our blind spots are, and this book does a really good job of exposing those. And a lot of the work that you have to do in the social sciences when you're dealing with undergraduates and even graduate students is you're trying so hard to try to get people to understand basic cognitive fallacies, basic cognitive biases, logical fallacies, and cognitive biases to understand how to do better research, to understand how to think more precisely. And this is the kind of book that does a really good job of that. Now, on some details, I can always find places to critique things in terms of details. And actually, on a lot of the examples that he uses and so on, they fell very flat with me. Like he would have a test case, wording of what do you think when you see this, or a diagram, which line is longer, whatever. And generally speaking, I would look at those, or I would hear or read the test case and not fall for what the result of, oh, you probably thought this. Generally just didn't work for me. There were a few cases where it did, but the majority I would say didn't. So in that regard, part of it is probably because I've spent so much time training my system 1, as he would talk about it, to be careful, and training my system 2 to be constantly alert. And that's one of the things that I think is valuable in this book, is he talks a lot about how system 2, the more careful, the slower way of thinking, thinking statistically, thinking intentionally about things, that tends to be a fairly lazy in most people. Most people go through life operating on system 1 as often as possible because it takes effort to engage system 2. And actually that helped give me some language for why I'm so constantly frustrated with so many people, is because I actually, and I've talked to my wife about this before, that I get frustrated that I feel like there's only so many people who I regard as awake. And I don't mean this in like the political sense of woke. I mean, like, you talk to this person or you watch this person go through life, and this person is actually awake and is like thinking and making decisions with eyes wide open, as opposed to just going through life automatically, which I get frustrated when people do that. And it's like, wait a second, this language of system 1, most people do go through life system 1, and I get frustrated with those people. Yeah. Because my system 2 is almost always on.
Yeah.
And I think that, and I'm somewhat biased. I mean, as I said to Carrie the other day, my wife, I was like, we all tend to think this way, that, oh, it's so great that there's so much diversity in the world, and that there's so many different types of people in the world. But man, it would be so much better if everybody were just like us. Just sort of summarizing the humorous way that we all think. Yeah. And to some degree, I'm as bad as anybody else with that idea that, dang it, everybody else should have their system 2 going at all times as well, despite how exhausted that apparently leaves most people. But, those are my preliminary thoughts, though. I found it very useful. I think the language that he uses is very helpful. I think most of the examples are illustrative and useful, even though they maybe didn't always work on me as a reader. I think this is one of those books that I'd probably put in the top 5 or so that we've read so far, that we've profiled so far, in terms of what I'd recommend people read.
Yeah. I loved the book. It was one of my favorites so far, and in fact, I would put it at number 2 overall, including the books from last year. So it's one of those books. I say we've read some books that are important, and other books that are fun and enjoyable, but rarely do the two meet.
Yeah, this one's kind of both.
This one's both. Like it's a joy to read. It's fun to read, and for me, I almost fell for every single one of those things in the book.
Dang it! Turn on your system 2.
I know I need to turn on system 2, and actually the review I put up on the website, I started out with talking about my wife with when she confronts me about things, because I think most of the time when I'm doing stuff around the house, I'm just in. I'm in La La Land, because I'm listening to podcasts if I'm doing chores or something, or I'm not even thinking about the task at hand. I'm just doing system 1, and she's probably coming at it more from system 2, where she's thinking through, like, well, why did you do it that way? Why didn't you do it this way? That it makes more sense to do it this way.
And what's honestly, funny about that is out of the family, out of my family, mm-hmm. Of which obviously she's my sister, she's probably the most system 1 of our family.
Yeah.
Like my dad and I are very much like system 2 is always on.
Yeah.
And then, Stephanie a little bit less so. Yeah. And then and she's still getting after you for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we're very we were very raised to be very a very system two family.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I think is a great thing. So yeah, in a lot of the examples in the book, I loved it because I would read the example and be like, yeah, and then he would describe exactly what's going on in my mind. And whereas you knew you didn't fall for that, I would fall probably 90% of the time.
Well, it's like the baseball thing, right? You know, there's the one with there's an illustration. We should probably pull that up because it tends to be so influential.
I remember seeing this problem before, and that's the only reason I didn't fall for this one. I remember seeing this on a test like in elementary school or middle school or something. But
okay, here it is. So here's a simple puzzle. Do not try to solve it, but listen to your intuition. A bat and ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And then he follows that up. A number came to your mind. That number, of course, is 10 cents. Of course, the number that came to my mind was 5. Because I went, bat and ball, the bat costs $1 more than the ball. Okay, well, it can't be $1.10, so it's got to be $1.05. It's got to be $1.05 because 5. Okay, that works. So I mean, it just automatically, right? I guess for most people,
for me, I'm thinking 10. So. But I think that's a great problem that highlights the difference between system 1 and system 2, because system 1's looking for the easy answer. And so you hear a 10, you hear $1.10. Oh, it's $1 difference. And okay, it's $1.10. Okay, there's a difference, but it doesn't equal $1.10. So
yeah, there's the famous diagram of the lines in there with the fins, and the name of that is escaping me. Again, for me, I look at that and the first thing is if somebody tells me, tell me which line is longer, I immediately block out the fins. Yeah. Like, okay, well, there you go. Okay. So I mean, if I look for it, I can see the illusion, but it's like, well, you should be ignoring the fins though.
But what's interesting too, though, is when he puts in a multiplication problem where it's two digit numbers. And I know some people can probably do that in their head quickly, but most people you have to stop and think about it. So his point there is that you have to ignite system 2 to solve that. Whereas 1 + 1, that's system 1. You could do that easily. 3 × 3, you can do that easily. But two digit numbers, and when you initiate system 2 to take on that multiplication problem, your pupils dilate.
Yes. Yeah. When you're in heavy focus for anything, yeah, your pupils dilate. And actually, it's if anybody has a cat, when you can see this, whenever cats really focus on something, you see their pupils dilate like really obviously. We do the same thing. It's just our pupils don't dilate as wide as theirs, so it's not as obvious. But it actually does happen. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I found that chapter really interesting. Yeah,
but it's like one of those things where it's out of your control. I mean, you can't, if you start thinking, if you ignite system 2, it's gonna cause other things to go on in your body that you don't control, that your pupils dilating. So yeah, that was really.
And the other thing is when you're in that state of focus, this is one thing that absolutely works on me is that you can block out all sorts of other things that you don't realize you didn't see. And of course, the famous example of that, he mentions this, the invisible gorilla, with the movie there, where you're counting the number of basketball players or the number of basketball passes of a basketball by a team, and you have this whole thing going on. I'm not going to. We'll put a link to the video in the show notes, but I won't say anything more about that because I want the listener to be able to experience it if you haven't. But if you have, you know what I'm talking about. That video absolutely worked on me. I did this some years ago, and it was one of those where it's like, oh my goodness. But knowing me, it's not that surprising. If I get focused, it's absolutely tunnel vision. Again, my wife has laughed that she'll ask me a question, and I'll go 10 minutes, 12 minutes just working, and as though I didn't hear a thing, and then 10 minutes later turn and answer her as though she just asked the question like 5 seconds ago. And she's like, what do you, but because I was focused. And then all of a sudden, as soon as my focus breaks, something happened. And oh yeah, you asked about, so, focus. And again, that understanding that that's a particular state of consciousness or a particular state of cognition that comes with certain limitations is useful to understand, and knowing what those limitations are going to be is useful. Mm-hmm. So,
one thing I really liked about this book is that that basketball video came up in at least one, I think more than one book last year of last year's Books of Titans, but it was never described as well as it was in this book. And I think the System 1, System 2 really helped him explain it better. But I was starting last year to get sick of hearing the same examples over and over in the same books. But this book was unique in that he did some of those same examples, the same stories, but it was like he had a fresh take on it, which was really unique. So again, another reason why this book really stands out.
It was just flat out written better in some of those cases.
Yeah. Well, our next section is usually our favorite quotes of the book, and this time we're going to do favorite quotes, but we're also going to do things that stood out to us, interesting points or good advice, things that aren't as much of a discussion point, and then after that we'll get into more than the nitty gritty. But let's start off with Jason with one of your favorite quotes.
This one's going to come from the end, this from toward the end of the book, the last chapter. He talks about the focusing illusion. So this is specifically connected with ratings of personal happiness and all this. But the focusing illusion, he says, can be described in a single sentence. Nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you are thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one.
I love that quote because we're all like that.
Yeah.
And this is one of those things that, I'm always trying to explain to people that one of the most liberating things to realize in life is that everybody else is as self-absorbed and concerned with themselves as you are. And so once you realize that, you don't have to actually think that other people are constantly judging you or looking at you because they're really actually worried about you looking at them and judging them. That once you realize that, you're free to live, you're free to do whatever, because, even if they are judging you and looking at you, eventually it still comes back to how it affects them. And people just really aren't as concerned about you as you are concerned about you. And this takes that a step further to everything. Whatever your attention is on at the moment is less important than what you think it is at that moment.
Yeah.
I love that quote.
Yeah, that's a good one. I just have one quote and then some good advice and things that I think would be helpful to listeners if you haven't read the book, or if you have, just as reminders. So I'll do my one quote and then go into those other things interspersed with Jason's quotes. So my quote, because adherence to standard operating procedures is difficult to second guess, decision makers who expect to have their decisions scrutinized with hindsight are driven to bureaucratic solutions and extreme reluctance to take risks.
Yeah, that's a really good one. We're going to need to develop that a little bit. But yeah, actually, I found that entire section of the book, for anybody who has any managerial responsibility or particularly executive responsibility, that section of the book having to do with hindsight bias and how that impacts decision making and risk taking, I thought was brilliant, and thought it was really well done and usefully put. Particularly some of the action items that he gives for handling some of the natural biases that people have cognitively and limitations that people have and that organizations tend to have. I found that really useful, but you'll probably get to that in a moment.
Yeah. So go ahead. No, go ahead with your next one.
Okay. So my next one is, again, from toward the end. It is only a slight exaggeration to say that happiness is the experience of spending time with people you love and who love you. It's not actually all that connected with a lot of the rest of the book, but again, it's very true.
Yeah. All right. My first interesting point here is that frowning increases the vigilance of system 2 thinking. So he would talk about if you put a pen in your mouth with the end, like the cap in your mouth straight ahead, and you frown, it actually helps ignite system 2. Whereas if you put the pen or pencil in your mouth the other way, so it's kind of aligned with your smile.
It has to do with your teeth.
Yeah.
It has to do with whether it's in your teeth, whether you have your lips on it and you're frowning, or whether it's in your teeth without smile, or without your lips touching, which forces you into kind of smile.
Yeah. Again, just kind of like the pupils dilating, just a really fascinating.
Yeah, the physiological connections between processing mentally and the body. That's interesting stuff.
It's crazy. So go ahead with your next one.
Okay, obviously Amos Tversky. Amos Tversky and I often joked that we were engaged in studying a subject about which our grandmothers knew a great deal. Yep.
Yeah. Yep. Grandpa and Grandma's wisdom.
Yep. And actually, that's connected to a larger quote, which is worthwhile. The concept of loss aversion is certainly the most significant contribution of psychology to behavioral economics. This is odd because the idea that people evaluate many outcomes as gains and losses, and that losses loom larger than gains, surprises no one. Amos and I joked that we were engaged in studying a subject about which our grandmothers knew a great deal. And that connects with something that a colleague of mine who did her PhD with me a few years ago, we were in the same cohort. She once said, and I think she's right about this, that there's really two types of research, two types of good research, in particularly in our type of field or in social sciences, that sort of thing. But basically, two good types of research. One is the kind that makes you go, "Huh, interesting," right? So you've got that. And the other is the one that makes you slap your forehead and go, duh. So, and those are the two types of good research that are out that you can do. One is the, huh, and the other is the, duh. Oh, and it's that. And actually I think that there's a third type that's both. That's the head slap, duh, and then, huh. Following the duh, but this, a lot of what Kahneman and Tversky did with some of their most influential work, which is covered in this book, was absolutely the head slap variety, which is like, oh, that's just the most obvious thing in the world. It's not counterintuitive at all. It's the most obvious thing in the world, but it goes against all sorts of economic or probability theory or whatever, the theoretical stuff that was governing things when they came out with it. And it's like, no, actually that just doesn't work.
Well, and to take a tangent of what you're talking about, one thing that was really neat about this book was to see the two of them come up with the tests and the research to have people do to learn about these things. I mean, because you have to think long and hard of how do we best create a situation for people to come up with these decisions? What are the questions we use? All that. And they kept doing it over and over. And to see what kind of things they did for that was really fascinating. But all right, my second one is going to fall under good advice. So he says, before you discuss a contentious issue in a meeting, have everyone write down what they think first. Because what oftentimes happens in a meeting is maybe the senior person will give their view, and then everyone will kind of go towards that because you don't want to make the boss mad, or people will forget their original thought after hearing a number of other people speak. And so he suggested having everyone write it down and then either pass it up to the front or keep it by you. But the point is, then you discuss it, and then after that you can bring up the original idea so that none of those is lost through just somebody not getting to speak or being being discussed over by other people in the meeting.
It's interesting.
That was just a brilliant.
It's brilliant, but it also connects to the advice of two other books that we discussed last year, right? The Effective Executive. Mm-hmm. That talks some about the necessity of getting people to write out their ideas and the importance of making sure that one person doesn't dominate a meeting like that. So that's already in there in that sense. But this adds to it, and also what's his name? The
Iacocca, right?
Iacocca emphasized. Exactly that too. Of no, force your assistants, force your people to write out what they think, and
on
then
one piece of paper,
and then have the discussion with them, because then they'll have something to say. They'll have an established position, and you'll get better stuff.
Yeah,
absolutely right. So this is it's one of those things. Recurring themes like this that come up in Books of Titans or in multiple Books of Titans books. This is the kind of kernel of wisdom that you probably ought to put into practice in your everyday life, listeners. Yeah. And that's the sort of thing that we're trying to implement in our own in that regard as well. This definitely has shown up more than once, and I think I agree with it.
Yeah. All right, okay. You have a quote.
Yeah. So this one, actually, I'm going to be using this quote in the book that I'm presently editing. I decided to pull this quote and I'm using it in one of my chapters, it looks like. So I like it that much.
Nice.
I'll use actually part of it, but he's referring to Bernoulli's theory. This is in chapter 26, where he's talking about their introduction of prospect theory. He says Bernoulli's theory, he says the longevity of the theory, which had been around for about 250 years, the longevity of the theory is all the more remarkable because it is seriously flawed. The errors of a theory are rarely found in what it asserts explicitly. They hide in what it ignores or tacitly assumes. Mm-hmm. That last piece is so true. And so much of the work that I've done, I've been saying exactly that sort of thing, but this says it so perfectly well. I'm going to use this quote, but it is this idea that theories get put in place, and the flaws of the theory are often hidden in precisely what the theory takes for granted. Mm-hmm. And it's only once you actually reevaluate the foundations of the theory that you recognize, wait, there's serious limitations here. There's serious flaws. And he says elsewhere, it's a striking example of theory-induced blindness that this obvious flaw in Bernoulli's theory failed to attract scholarly notice for more than 250 years. And one of the things that I'm trying to address in the book that I'm working on now, which is based on my dissertation, is actually addressing a very similar situation where there's some theoretical stuff that I'm addressing that has been dominant in scholarship, has been a dominant perspective in scholarship for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting here going, how did no one notice this?
Yeah.
How has no one? I mean, this is actually really obvious,
and it's taken for granted by everyone.
And it's been taken for granted by everyone for centuries. And now what's funny is that other people who've read my initial article on the planting the flag on what I'm doing in this book and some other things, other people who've come across it have had the same reaction on, oh my gosh, like how first of all, how has no one seen this before? And secondly, how did you notice it, right? And it's one of those like, but this was obvious. And so my next quote will be connected to that, but I'm gonna turn it over to you for the next insight, and then I'll connect to his statement on this, which is exactly how I tend to think about it as well. So,
all right, this one goes out to the married men out there who are investors. Women achieve better investment results than men. So men, turn your investments over to your wives. No, there was a really good chapter about that. And a lot of it has to do with, I mean, if you buy into the market and you stay there and you're in a fund, it's not just an individual stock. if you stick with that and don't sell and don't try to time the market, you end up doing a lot better. And women have that generally here have that patience and have a better mind for that than men who want to jump out of the market, get back in. And the more you do that, the more you're spending in fees to do that. And you actually are not that good at timing the market. So women achieve better investment results than men.
On the aggregate, yes.
On the aggregate, yes.
And actually, that's an important thing throughout this book, is that this book is consistently, as with most research of this type, dealing with the aggregate.
Yeah.
So there are exceptions to all sorts of these things, but again, understanding the aggregate is really important because most of us fall in the aggregate. Mm-hmm. And it's also worth noting, by the way, that that the response of a lot of the people who fall more in line of the rational model of economics observe that and he acknowledges, actually, you can see that he's been a part of this discussion for quite a long time. And I think he represents his interlocutors in this regard fairly, but he observes that actually the reason that econs, this construct of econs, which he says, this type of person really doesn't exist, the reason that it's been so persistent in economic in the field of economics is that the theories based on it work pretty well. Mm-hmm. And actually, the thing that many who are still committed to a more rational choice model of economics observe that on the aggregate, so individuals may be irrational, but on the aggregate, the choices steer towards what is actually rational in that regard. And that's one of the and I'm oversimplifying that a little bit, but basically on the aggregate, decisions start to push toward toward the rational. And so you can assume rationality even if the individual actors are irrational. That's one of the responses of that side of things. And again, the truth is maybe a little bit closer to the middle there. Well,
let's discuss that for a minute. So what do economists think of his work? I mean, did
he won the Nobel Prize in economics?
In economics, yes. Yeah. But did it upend a lot of the theories? Did a lot of things change, or is everything kind of still the same? And they kind of look at him as an outlier, or did he really have a huge impact on economics?
He's had a massive impact on economics, largely through the impact of Richard Thaler, who also has won the Nobel Prize. Actually, he won the 2017 Nobel Prize in economics for his contributions there. But basically, the contributions of Kahneman and Tversky and then later on Thaler, depending on a lot of their work, that has basically involved the creation of an entirely new branch of economics. So it's not a matter of it being an outlier. It's actually a new, theoretical branch that other aspects of economics have to take into account. And there's been a lot of impact of behavioral economics on governmental policy, on things, for example, the concept of nudge, and the idea of making things opt in versus opt out, and how that impacts whether or not people, whether or not citizens do what is best for them. Those concepts come straight out of the behavioral psychological or behavioral economic research and the psychological approach that Kahneman brings. And that stuff's had some significant impact on governmental decisions worldwide, particularly in the UK, some in the US, and then also Scandinavia. There's been some major developments applying that. So yeah, there's been a pretty big impact.
President Obama really took to him, didn't he?
Yeah. Richard Thaler definitely had some big impact on that. On Obama.
Yeah, actually, would like to read. I added Nudge to my potential list for next year. I think that would be a good one interesting one to read.
Yeah, and it's based on a lot of the same stuff as this one, so there will be some overlap.
Yeah. All right, your turn for a quote.
All right, so this is the second part of what I was just talking about, and it's when he was talking about when he first stumbled across what became prospect theory, which was really his biggest contribution, and it's what led to the Nobel Prize for him. He said, Amos and I stumbled on the central flaw of Bernoulli's theory by a lucky combination of skill and ignorance. And then he said he'd been working on looking at some of these principles, and he said, I did not know enough about utility theory to be blinded by respect for it, and I was puzzled. And then later on, he says, knowledge of perception and ignorance about decision theory both contributed to a large step forward in our research. And actually that I think gets back to another concept that we've talked about before, and that's the think like a child concept. That has come up in more than one Books of Titans book, that if you want to take quantum leaps forward in research or in business or whatever, take a step back and say, wait a second, what are the assumptions that everybody has? What are the assumptions that I have now that if I were a complete novice, if I knew nothing about this, that I wouldn't have? And let me re-examine this from that angle. And it's hard to do. It's really hard to do. And he talks about the cognitive problems, the cognitive difficulties of doing that. Once you change your mind, once you embrace a theory, it's hard to go back to the state before you knew it. But, I've said in the past, one of the strengths of my, of why I've done good research in my area is that I'm just ignorant and stupid enough to keep things simple. To assume that there's certain simple things. And so I end up not getting swayed by some of the more complex theories that everybody else is depending on. And oftentimes I've willfully ignored them, tried not to learn them and tried to evaluate things before I ever learned them. And then that leads to better results. And this is what happened with him there. Embracing one's ignorance and applying what you know to a new area, having new eyes for a new area can really be useful.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with pride too. And I always remember my first year working at Russell Corporation, and I was in a meeting and one of the top executives came into the meeting and asked questions that I would have been embarrassed to ask. And no one else in the room would have asked, but they were really important questions, and no one was discussing them for fear out of hurt pride that they would look stupid asking these questions. But there was a lot of power in him asking those questions because it brought a lot of assumptions up that maybe people weren't thinking about. So I think in line with that, a lot of people probably avoid the type of thinking you're discussing because of fear of looking dumb too.
Yeah, I think that's generally right. And again, it's you get blinded by respect for a theory because you assume that whoever came up with that theory, I mean, if everybody's been operating according to this theory for 250 years, obviously they know more than I do. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe they probably did, but let's take another look at it. Let's just evaluate it. And maybe I'm just too thick in the head to quite get why I don't understand why this works. But if I'm noticing that something doesn't quite add up, that's where, you do follow your intuition sometimes. That's where System 1 is starting to get that. And we have to be careful not to let the pride of wanting to make sure that, you don't get seen as the one who doesn't really get the theory. Mm-hmm. No, I don't get it because it's wrong. I don't get it because it doesn't explain this. I've tried this like 20 times and it doesn't work. That's a good path forward.
Yeah.
All right. Your next one.
All right. My next piece of good advice. If you're in a negotiation and the first number that the other person throws out is outrageous, leave. Because if that number's on the table, whether you think it is or not, it is in your head and it's on the table. So if it is completely out of the realm of where you even want to be near negotiating, it's better to leave and either have them come back at you with
he says to actually make a scene.
Yeah. Which I could see you doing because I know you have good stories of car buying and that type of thing. So but just another really good piece of advice. If it's outrageous, don't try to negotiate your way to what you want. It's better just to leave.
Yeah. Yeah. Another one from me. This is actually him quoting Herbert Simon on intuition. He says, intuition is nothing more and nothing less than recognition.
Yeah.
Love it.
I had that one written down.
Love it.
That's good.
And the thing is, what that means is if you want to train intuition, you have to train intuition through the process of a ton of repetition and a ton of exposure to cause and effect. And if you want to develop expertise, and there's a lot in this book about how to develop expertise, and it plugs in nicely with the work of Anders Ericsson and, you know, the 10,000 hours of deliberate practice and all this stuff. If you want to develop expertise, you need to put yourself in a position where you have tons of reps and you get to see the outcomes of each repetition and learn from that. And over time, you internalize that, and then that recollection becomes intuition. And that I think is a really valuable way to think about it. And it's a good way to think about education, and a good way to think about, you know, training children. Is that's what it's about. It's about repeating each rep, each little lesson enough times that it gets internalized so that the intuition gets built and it's now automatic. Yeah.
And we saw that in Josh Waitzkin's book.
Yep.
The Art of Learning, where he talked about he talked about it more in the unconscious versus conscious, but where with the conscious, you're building habits within the conscious mind that the more you do them, it gets transferred to the unconscious mind, and then it's part there. So my next one is another piece of good advice, and this goes in line, Jason, with what you were talking about earlier. To teach, you must surprise. Kind of that,
yeah,
or duh. But I think back to the teachers that had the most impact on me. And I can still remember the class. I can remember where I was sitting in the class, and I remember being shocked by what they said. You know, you have a number of teachers that drone on, and it could be about important things, but it's almost like a joke. It's almost like the Steve Martin book we read, where the things that stick out to you are when something takes an unexpected twist. And for the teacher that can surprise you with what they're teaching you, you are more apt to remember that than just somebody mindlessly droning on about a topic.
Yeah.
So I thought even for, as people are thinking about that in terms of how can I get somebody to remember this, try to present it in a way that surprises them.
Yep. Find ways of forcing people to have an answer and then be corrected by what they learn, and that's that much more valuable.
Yeah.
All right. So the next one from me. The premise of this book is that it is easier to recognize other people's mistakes than our own. That's a pretty strong premise.
Yeah.
In my experience, for sure. It also comes at the end of something that was kind of comical to me for reasons that might be different from a lot of other people, and that I'm somewhat abnormal here. He says, as a way to live your life, however, continuous vigilance is not necessarily good, and it is certainly impractical. Constantly questioning our own thinking would be impossibly tedious, and System 2 is much too slow and inefficient to serve as a substitute for System 1 in making routine decisions. Well, spend some time with me and my wife, and you'll discover that, we actually are, in many cases, good examples of System 2 is much too slow and inefficient to serve as a substitute for System 1. Not so much in that we default to System 1. It's that it took us like 9 months to buy the proper sized comforter for our bed after we got married, because I had one that was a full size, and we had a queen size bed that we were sharing we'd gotten the queen size bed when we got married. We were sharing the old comforter from when I was sleeping on a full size before we got married. And obviously that was not the best situation because the covers weren't enough to cover both of us most of the time.
Well, it is if you want to be close.
Right. Well, yeah, but it was an unstable situation. It did not lead to the best outcomes. But we wanted to make the best choice on what kind of comforter we got for our bed. That's a commitment. We're going to have this for some years, and we don't want to, get one that's not the right value for what we're going to get. We don't want to spend too much on one. So it took us I think it was 9 months to actually buy one. And then finally we got fed up and went and bought one. And it was
you guys can discuss ad nauseum. Yeah.
It's like, wow, this is great. We have one that we slept so much better. And it's sometimes that overvigilance is definitely a downside. But he says the best we can do is compromise, learn to recognize situations in which mistakes are likely, and try harder to avoid significant mistakes when the stakes are high. And so where I'm having to learn to compromise is to default to system one in some cases and go, just buy the thing, or just do, what seems best on the first guess more often. Whereas for lots of other people, the tendency may need to go in the other direction. But that learning to compromise is something that this between the systems is something that this book spends a large amount of time on. And again, it's a very valuable lesson.
Yeah. And that's something that really stuck out to me in the book too. And kind of going into it a little bit more, we can easily spot other people's problems because most of us are thinking about other people in system two, whereas we really operate ourselves more from system one. So it's really hard for us to understand where we're falling short or hurting others or doing things incorrectly, but other people can easily see that. So one note I made is I really need to be listening to my wife more, because if anyone is going to know me, it's going to be her. With me all the time, and able to see me in a way that I'm not able to see myself. So yeah, I liked that point as well. All right. So my next piece of good advice, and this stuck out to me as a web developer, because one thing I try to do is to make things as easy to read and easy to find as possible. But he gave a situation where using a bad font can actually make people remember it more.
That is literally that is literally the passage that I was looking at for my next one. Go for it.
So yeah, if you have a bad font or even colors that don't mix well, and someone has to kind of, do their eyes a little bit to see it better, they have to put a little more effort into it. There's points where that can actually be more beneficial to you, where they will remember whatever you have written in that bad font.
I'll just go ahead and build to the next 2 points underneath that, which are also great advice. If you care about being thought credible and intelligent, do not use complex language where simpler language will do. Mm-hmm. I always have to reinforce this with students and others that, listen, if you can't say it simply, then first of all, you probably don't understand it well enough. And secondly, it's not going to be as effective communicating it. Find a way to say, it's the old Mark Twain idea. Never say policeman when cop will do. And then he goes on beyond that, and he says, in addition to making your message simple, try to make it memorable. Put your ideas in verse if you can. They will be more likely to be taken as truth.
Yeah.
And that chapter actually that's chapter 6 on norms, surprises, and causes. The value of how to get messages across and to be believed, extremely important for those of us who want to be more persuasive, who want to understand how to get our points across and to use the various biases and limitations built into the human psyche to take advantage of that to best get across what we believe to be true, to make our case more persuasively. Yeah,
and especially anyone involved in propaganda. Great chapter.
Yeah. But again, propaganda is not always wrong.
Yeah.
You use propaganda for good things.
Yep.
For good, not for evil. Don't be evil now, Google.
Another good advice. I thought this was interesting. He said, if you are at the doctor and the anesthesiologist says something, listen to them, because they are the closest to the problem, or they see the most immediate result. So he was contrasting that with a doctor who said, well, this may happen in 6 months from now, to the anesthesiologist who, once they put that needle in you and administer the whatever they're putting into you, if they observe that something doesn't feel right, listen to them, because that immediate connection between cause and effect is powerful. And the longer that distance is, the more we as people get the solution or the answer wrong.
Yeah. I think I'm fairly fresh out of favorite quotes and lessons, and ready to move into some critique and other things. I don't know about if you have any more life lessons here from the book.
Yeah, let me do 2 more. One, I wanted to see if you remembered the since I am such a lover of sugar, I wanted to see if the glucose comment stuck out to you.
It stuck out because actually I am aware that that hasn't held up in attempts to replicate.
Oh, okay.
So this is one. There are a number of there are a few places in this book that I highlighted in a different color, because they're things that I'm aware in the last 10 to 15 years, or in some cases the last 4 years, 5 years, have been challenged or overturned.
Okay.
And this is one of those where ego depletion being undone by ingesting glucose, so that you're able to better make decisions. You regain some of your recover from some of your decision fatigue. That, I believe, was one of the 100 psychological studies that was attempted to be replicated in the recent meta study that was trying to replicate 100 really famous studies. This one did not replicate. So there's some question as to whether or not it's legit. So sorry for those of you who eat like hummingbirds, like Eric, have the diet of a hummingbird. That may not actually hold up. So
okay,
there may be something to it, but again, it didn't replicate the last time, as I recall.
Yeah, and if you're not familiar with it, it's basically the idea that if you become tired due to effort of will or self-control, that can be overcome or undone by ingesting glucose. So I just thought it was funny because I like eating sugar. Yeah. And then the last one, interesting point I thought was, it's easier to fall into temptation when our system too is taxed. So if you are asked to solve that multiplication problem with big numbers, temptation may be easier for you if your system too is taxed. So probably a lot of variables going on there, but I thought that one was interesting as well.
Yep, that's a good one. Now let's go ahead and get to some critiques and so on. I've been kind of itching to get to a couple of these. Yeah. The first one on my list, he spends some time discussing the hot hand fallacy, as he calls it.
It's one thing I really wanted to discuss. So good.
So what I want to hear your thoughts on this first.
Well, this was the hardest concept of the book for me. Basically the regression to the mean. And from what I understand of it, it's basically the Sports Illustrated problem. Whenever someone's on the cover of Sports Illustrated, they tend to do a lot worse after that. So the idea is that they're peaking, they're kind of above average here. They get highlighted on Sports Illustrated, and then they regress to the mean after that. And so that whatever they did to get them on the cover of Sports Illustrated, they certainly didn't keep that up.
Yeah, and that's connected to some degree. And actually, regression to the mean is an important concept, and we can talk about that in a moment. But that's connected loosely to this idea of the hot hand. I'll read the little blurb about this in here, and then I'll address some more recent stuff on it. So he says, some years later, Amos Tversky and his students Tom Gilovich and Robert Vallone caused a stir with their study of misperceptions of randomness in basketball. The fact that players occasionally acquire a hot hand is generally accepted by players, coaches, and fans. The inference is irresistible. A player sinks 3 or 4 baskets in a row, and you cannot help forming the causal judgment that this player is now hot, with a temporarily increased propensity to score. Players on both teams adapt to this judgment. Teammates are more likely to pass to the hot scorer, and the defense is more likely to double team. Analysis of thousands of sequences of shots led to its disappointing conclusion. There is no such thing as a hot hand in professional basketball, either in shooting from the field or scoring from the foul line. Of course, some players are more accurate than others, but the sequence of successes and missed shots satisfies all tests of randomness. The hot hand is entirely in the eye of the beholders, who are consistently too quick to perceive order and causality in randomness. The hot hand is a massive and widespread cognitive illusion. And this was a widely celebrated study for over 25 years. It was done in 1985. Very important. A lot, and it was regarded as sort of the victory of cold statistics over, basically conventional wisdom in sport or whatever.
Or the problem is,
the problem is that it has been pretty significant. I mean, I think basically completely persuasively overturned in the last 4 years.
Okay.
And I'm a little bit mad because the people who did it beat me to it. Tim and I were actually looking at doing a study that was going to overturn this because when we looked at it, we were not persuaded by the way that by the methodology of the study, in terms of how they assessed randomness, and how they assessed the statistical, the way that they did the stats for it. And a couple other people came in and they, one set did basically along the lines of what we were going to do and did it probably better than we would have. So, not much we can complain about, but basically now the hot hand basically has been restored to its concept that this does exist. And for a couple reasons. One is, there was a study that used more robust data that included where shots actually come from on the floor and basically included the difficulty of shots based on that data, and concluded that players who were hitting more shots in a row, actually their next shot tended to be a little bit more difficult. And so there was some correspondence of improve. You expect as shots get more difficult that the percentages would decrease, but they didn't. And so basically it was like, well, it does seem that it does seem to be some improvement in that they're hitting more difficult shots. So that was one of them. That was the less persuasive paper, and that was a 2014 paper. That was an important one. But the one that really, I think, nailed it more than anything was one done by Joshua Miller. This was maybe 2 years ago. And what Miller did is he basically did a mathematical analysis, and I think his critique was bigger, or was more foundational. And it's that you can't apply statistics the way that they did because they're applying post hoc statistics. They're taking the statistics. So if you're a 47% shooter at the end of the season, and then I go back and I take a look at the full data set, I'm going to expect you to be basically a 47% shooter with various patterns that can show up in different ways in there. But of course it's going to look like it passes the test of randomness because I already know the statistical outcome at the end. What he does is he basically says, no, actually, probability by its very nature has a cold hand built into the laws of probability. So if you flip a coin and you get heads, what's the likelihood that you're going to get tails next? You would think it would be exactly 50%. The probability of getting tails on any flip is 50%. But if you have a finite number of coin flips or shot attempts or any other probability-based event, ultimately, the probability reverts to the mean. So if you get a heads, and if you have two flips, you get heads, you're actually, based on the laws of probability, you're more likely than not to get tails next. Right? And so he actually addresses this, and he shows this with some very complex math to explain how this is built into probabilities, particularly if you have post hoc probabilities.
So it would be probability versus mean then? mean would be 50%, and then probability, if you already had heads, would be
right.
Probability was where it would be different.
Right. Basically, you've got a difference between probability. You've got probability while accounting for regression to the mean, and the general and basically understanding that probability is not probability of finite numbers works a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. And the original paper didn't account for this. When he went back and he dug up the data that they had, he actually found that the hot hand difference went from effectively 0 to about 12%.
Okay.
And that I found very persuasive. And there are a few other issues here in terms of how actually in this section of the book, Kahneman is really adamant that, no, listen, statistics just show that this is a result of luck. Like if you're a 47% shooter, you're a 47% shooter, and the outcomes of any individual shot or any series of shots is based on plugging your 47% in with luck, and then you get, your random outcomes. And that's just not the way things work as soon as you have human causality built in. Mm-hmm. Because a person is not a 47% automaton. People do get better or get worse. Like if you're fatigued, I in doing a workout, for example, the other day, I often will do double unders, jumping rope where you have the rope pass under your feet twice as a way to, as a part of my conditioning. And if I'm really fatigued or I've had a rough few workouts in a row, I find that I trip more on the rope than if I'm really fresh. Mm-hmm. That's not statistical. That's actually a regression. That's a reduction in my capacity in that skill that happens as a result of me being embodied and flawed and potentially fatigued and all that. That gets factored in, and that you can try to call that luck or whatever, but it's not random chance. It's not random probability. It's actually more complex than that. And some of Kahneman's discussion of golf, of some of the sporting event stuff that he does in terms of how he says, well, the explanations are causal, but we know that that it's really just a matter of luck and numbers and probabilities. It's really more complicated than that. Yes, mm-hmm. Luck and probabilities factor in, but you also have to account for that people are moving targets, and that a golfer may not have slept well the night before, and you chalk that up to luck or not, or maybe he did sleep well, but just today he, for whatever reason, like he's not feeling it. Mm-hmm. And he talks elsewhere in the book about flow, and this is where in a couple places in this book I found that there was some contradictory stuff, and it mostly centered in this section. If you talk about flow and this ability to get into a state of consciousness where you're automatically able to focus and do things better and do it with less with less perceived effort and all of that, which he acknowledges that is a human experience earlier in the book. And then you're going to say, well, there can't be such a thing as a hot hand. The hot hand is flow.
Yeah.
I've been, and that's the thing. The reason that players and others basically ignored this data for 25 years, even though a lot of people said, well, the metrics are clear, is if you've been there, I've been there on the basketball floor where you hit 8 or 9 shots in a row, and like this is not a feeling like I've felt in other cases. I know that if I take this next shot, I'm hitting it.
Yeah.
And it takes something to break that flow.
Yeah.
So
thank you, because that was the most difficult part of the book for me, and he's presenting all this data, but it's like something doesn't jibe here with my experience. And I think the other part that I had a real hard problem with is what about Jordan versus another guy in the league? Like, is it just Jordan's mean is higher, so
yes.
He regresses the mean? I understand
each individual player has their own skill level, which some players' skill level is higher than others, which means that player's mean for performance, or that player's median or mode of performance, is higher than another player who might be in the same situation.
Yeah.
So the idea there is that Jordan might score 69 points one night, against Cleveland, because he would always play well against Cleveland. But Jordan would score, 69 one night, or, 63 against the Celtics, and then, score 23 another night. And you say, well, geez, what happened? Did he get worse? No, he didn't get worse. There is some aspect of randomness in this that, some of it is this, that some nights that shot that would bounce in doesn't. And then there's also the fatigue and all these other things. And that's the part that I think the numbers approach doesn't always appreciate. It can approximate, but it doesn't. I think that there are oftentimes causal explanations for what numbers only approximate later. The numbers are post hoc. What you can't do is say, okay, Jordan scored 69 last night. He's going to revert to the mean, and his mean is, say, 32. So we should expect him to score 16 tomorrow night. You can't do that. Yeah. He might score 60 the next night because he just might be feeling it that week.
Yeah.
But and so you can't make predictions on that basis. But at the end of all of it, you can use the statistics to evaluate how good he was and establish what his mean was, and you can see where he did keep regressing back to that mean. But regression to the mean, to me, it's an important concept, and I talk about it a lot when I do my sports analysis. But it's one place where I think actually, in the way that he presented it in this book, regression to the mean is more often than not best treated as a good post hoc explanation for something rather than a predictive tool. Even though it can be useful for some predictions, that if you have an outlier, maybe expecting a reversion to the mean is a good idea. But it's not entirely predictive. It's a better post hoc explanation, which actually then, the irony of that is that it gives it a causal sense to it, where he's saying, we shouldn't think about things causally, that doesn't have a causal effect. It's just reversion to the mean. Well, that's your causal. So it's a substitute causal. And I think used that way, sometimes it can be a little bit dangerous. So I actually didn't think he did as good a job there. I was surprised in a couple places by his use of probability, which I thought was in a couple cases a little bit unsophisticated. One other example of that was where I was really actually quite surprised, was he used this example of he and his wife ran across a fellow psychological researcher named John at the Great Barrier Reef, and while they were on vacationing, while he and his wife were vacationing, and then about 2 weeks later, they were in a theater in London, and a latecomer came and sat next to me after the lights went down. When the lights came up, I saw that my neighbor was John, and he said, my wife and I were surprised at ourselves that we would have been more surprised if we'd met any acquaintance other than John in the next seat of a London theater. And he says, by any measure of probability, meeting John in the theater was much less likely than meeting any one of our hundreds of acquaintances, yet meeting John seemed more normal. And actually, that's a mistaken way of rendering probability there. In fact, if John tends to travel more than others of their acquaintances, they are in fact more likely to see John there than they are other friends of theirs who may not travel internationally as often.
And if they're friends, they probably have similar interests. And other hundreds of acquaintances. If anything, you would make the case that seeing their other hundreds of acquaintances there would be no more probable. So, and it would be no more or no less would be the default. And then if he travels more, then it is slightly more probable. So that betrays a little bit of a mistake in representing statistics, which, again, there are a few places in here where I was a little bit surprised by those kinds of comments. And again, the hot hand fallacy was a bit of an issue, and some of those things. But all right,
that doesn't take away from the strength of the book as a whole.
But how about, because if I recall correctly, this came in the same part. What about organizations? What about businesses? Because he takes on Good to Great by Jim Collins and says a lot of the companies that Jim Collins highlighted in that book, after that book was written, regressed to the mean, or they weren't hot anymore, and they had a period of they had a downturn after that being highlighted in that book. Is that similar? I mean, because we're talking about individual athletes compared to huge organizations. Was he more on? Was he?
I think there was
better on with
well,
that?
the thing is, it's interesting there too, because elsewhere in the book, on at least 2 occasions, he says that companies or stocks that have been doing well, that have gone up or have increased in value or whatever, are consistently more likely to continue their improvement, at least in the short run.
Mm-hmm.
Well, think about that. And he actually critiques investors for the tendency to sell the company that has gone up because, well, if it's a winner now, odds are, according to the data, it's going to be a winner. It's more likely to be a winner in the near future than a loser. So don't sell your winner because it's more likely to continue winning.
Yeah.
But that's actually at odds with the idea of reversion to the mean, right? This idea of there being a mean for companies at large to say, well, what you would expect then is, well, this company's done well now, so we need to sell. That's actually what you would conclude if you based everything on reversion to the mean, because, well, they've done well, but we can expect them to revert to the mean for companies in general after that. Yeah. So I thought that his explanation of reversion to the mean was problematic, and again, I think it was at odds with his explanation of other companies or of companies' performance elsewhere. I do think that he's not entirely wrong. And I do think that the good to great thing, the critique there, he's right that the companies that were profiled in good to great after the book was published did not do as well. I'm less likely to assign that to, say, reversion to the mean as I am to other factors. I'm less likely to give that explanation than Kahneman, but and of course these are debated topics in economics, but I do think it's important to recognize that no company, no individual is going to manage to maintain a high level of performance relative to everyone else or the field forever. Everything has an end of life cycle, and so there is a peak of performance for every individual or company. Identifying that's really difficult.
Except for Randy Moss.
Well, yeah.
And Eddie Van Halen.
And Jerry Rice.
Yes. Joe Montana.
Yeah, well. But anyway.
But he had Jerry Rice, though.
But no, I mean, I think we can oftentimes get misled by, and I think if if there is a flaw there, I think his flaw is going to be going towards basically reading a lack of causality in the numbers or lack of causality in other things because the numbers say that the numbers are actually the causal thing. Whereas actually, I think in many cases, numbers or the statistics help provide an explanatory window on what happened, but they don't actually. It's not necessarily a sufficient explanation to say, well, yeah, that just follows probability. Mm-hmm. Because every event that ever happens is actually improbable in the grand scheme of things. Right? I mean, the fact that you and I are talking today is astronomically improbable if we're going to start at, 3 centuries ago before our grandparents met one another and all that, and it all culminates in us talking on this podcast. It takes a tremendous amount of a tremendous number of improbable events to lead to that. Mm-hmm. But then regarding those things as improbable is actually potentially a flaw in how we understand probability. And I think this is where Taleb's stuff on skin in the game and some of his recent work on understanding probabilities a little bit more robustly rather than just looking at the numbers and regarding probability as having some sort of causal function is important. That's where, again, I think Taleb is useful there. And actually that's another place where Taleb, I think, is right and the behavioral school is mistaken. Is Taleb actually in Skin in the Game discusses the problem of that a lot of behavioral psychologists talk about, that you should regard, like if you're given $5 that you didn't have say at a casino, most people would be more willing to gamble with that $5 than they would be with what they walked in with. And and there's some discussion of this in this book, and most behavioral economists would say that's irrational because it's your money. Once you have it, it's your money no matter what. So regarding that as from a different pool isn't a mistake. And this is what, again, on that same Econ Talk podcast, Taleb talks about this. He says, behavioral economists have said something called mental accounting, which states exactly what you, talking to Russ Roberts, just said, that treating money according to source is irrational because these are one period models. And he said, here's the problem. That's how they view the world, as a one-shot experiment. They don't view the world as a repetition of bets. So if you look at the world as a repetition of bets under condition of survival, then mental accounting is not only not irrational, but is necessary. Any other strategy would be effectively irrational. Now, there is some discussion in Kahneman's book here of treating things as repetition and a repetition of bets, but even that is sort of one set of a repetition. What Taleb says is actually, if you play long enough, unless you engage in strategies where you do have that kind of mental accounting, unless you engage in those strategies to prevent yourself from completely getting cleaned out, everyone ultimately loses in the end. You eventually hit the zero bound. And he says, in other words, if you start betting in a casino, the strategy is as follows. You go in with 100, whatever you want, and you bet $1. If you lose your bet, you bet less than $1. If you bet, say, 90 cents or whatever. And if you make money, you start betting with the house money. And this is called playing with the market money or playing with the house money. And so you increase your bet as you're making money and you reduce your bet as you're losing money. That strategy is practically the only one that allows you to gamble or engage in risky strategy without ruin. I find that explanation from Taleb extremely persuasive. And it's a critique of the kind of approach of behavioral psychologists and to some degree of Kahneman in this book of you shouldn't take a different approach to the money that you just won or that you just got in a gift from what you would from your baseline. Now, that's irrational. And Taleb says, no, actually you're engaging in a more sophisticated survival strategy that is actually rational, and the behavioral economists haven't quite understood that.
Interesting. Because I have a couple of Taleb books on my list for this year, and I believe you were the one that recommended those as well. So, but Skin in the Game was not out yet, so that's not one of them. But perhaps next year. So, any other critiques before we hit the conclusions?
Yeah, I got one more, and this was a doozy. So he makes the case. He's making a case about the way that history works, and he says the often used image of the march of history implies order and direction. Marches, unlike strolls or walks, are not random. We think that we should be able to explain the past by focusing either on large social movements and cultural and technological developments or the intentions and abilities of a few great men. The idea that large historical events are determined by luck is profoundly shocking, though it is demonstrably true. It is hard to think of the history of the 20th century, including its large social movements, without bringing in the role of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong. But there was a moment in time just before an egg was fertilized when there was a 50-50 chance that the embryo that became Hitler could have been a female. Compounding the three events, there was a probability of 1/8 of a 20th century that without any of the three great villains, and it is impossible to argue that history would have been roughly the same in their absence. The fertilization of these three eggs had momentous consequences, and it makes a joke of the idea that long-term developments are predictable. And I read this and went, that's a problem. Not only is it not impossible to argue that history would have been roughly the same in their absence, it's fundamentally correct to make that argument. Had Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong never lived, the 20th century probably would have been more or less similar to, there would have been some differences due to personality, but the outcome of the 20th century would have been more or less the same. It would have been similar to what it was with them. This is one of the insights that my students have to walk away from my class on Jewish-Christian relations, which I've taught multiple times. My students walk away from that class after we've talked about the Holocaust for weeks, shocked. And I've had multiple students that have said, I used to think that if you could just go back in time and kill Hitler before he came into power, go back and have Hitler aborted or something, kill him as a child, then you could have prevented the Holocaust. But after reading this stuff and looking at what was going on and looking at how people were and just the trends that were going on, it would have happened without Hitler just as much as it did. Like it may have happened a little bit differently, but it would have happened either way. The people were going to do this. The Chinese Revolution did not depend on Mao's existence the same way. The revolution in the USSR did not depend on Stalin. Those men just filled the void that someone else would have come in and filled had they not existed. So, and actually the irony here is that he's actually making the great man of history fallacy. The idea that, this one great man changed everything and it wouldn't have happened without him. And there are some things that would never have happened without certain great individuals. I think that's true. But by and large, and this is where I think, who did the book that, it was like the third book we did. Geez.
22 Immutable Laws.
No.
Old Man in the Sea. Natural Born Heroes.
No, it was after that then. So it wasn't as far back as I thought. It was Heraclidean Fire, number 20. Wow. Yeah. So I think it was Irvin Chargaff in Heraclidean Fire that he talks about, like, listen, if some scientist doesn't make a specific scientific discovery, that doesn't mean that scientific discovery is not going to get made. Somebody else is going to come in and figure it out at some point. And there's some truth to that in the general thrust of history too. And I think he neglects that in his efforts to say, well, everything's basically random. It's just improbability is, just luck is governing everything. No, these social movements matter. And the thing is, on the aggregate, things are going in specific directions. Now, the flip side to that is that each individual one of us does have impact in where everything is going and how it gets from point A to point B. So Hitler did have an impact. Stalin did have an impact, a direct impact on how things went. But there is that chaos theory that, everything impacts everything else. But again, in their absence, we'd still have probably had something like the Holocaust. We would have still had communism. We still would have had a lot of these things even without them. Maybe a little different.
I just listened to James Altucher interview Jordan Peterson, and Peterson was at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And he said at the top, when you walk in, it says, "Never forget." And he said, never forget what? And that's at every Holocaust museum. And he said, it's not about never forgetting what happened. It's never forget that you could have been the Nazi. You could have done this.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that, again, my students have walked away from. I remember vividly one class where we were talking about the Holocaust, and I had my students at the end of that class just sort of sitting silently. And I had a couple students just sit there and just sort of say quietly, like, we could totally do this.
Yeah.
Like, I could totally see this sort of thing happening here. And that's scary.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Never forget. That's what we shouldn't forget. Hitler was not some unique monster. That's the frightening thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, should we head to conclusions on that bright note?
Yeah, I think maybe we should wrap it up.
I loved it. As I said at the beginning, it's my number 2 favorite out of all of them. That's 60 books so far that I've read between last year and this year for the Books of Titans project. This is number 2. I think it's just a really important book, and it's something since I've read it that I've thought about almost daily. We think all the time, we're thinking constantly. So to be able to take a step back and see how we think about things, how we have system 1 versus system 2, and how those interplay, and how it can trick us, and how to just be aware of those things, if nothing else, I think is an incredibly important thing. As you mentioned, it's a long book. It was one where I spent a lot of time in it. I had to read it very slowly, and I took a ton of notes on it, underlined a lot. So just the process of putting these ideas together in notes, writing in the back of the book, all these things, it took a tremendous amount of time, but I didn't want to rush it. I really wanted to take it in because just right away you could tell that this was something special. We've talked about this in the past. Just my last thought here, really, the one I remember the most is Once an Eagle, where we talked about Once an Eagle covering a lot of the lessons that we saw in a lot of the other Books of Titans books. Same thing with this one. We read a lot of psychology books last year. I would say you could get rid of all those, not read any of those, and just read this one, and have that be the benefit. I mean, he covers a lot of the stuff that's covered in those books, but he covers it better than those books. And I was just starting to get frustrated with a lot of those ones last year, where it was repeating the same examples over and over. But this one had a lot of new examples, a lot of different twists, and even the ones where it was the same example, he came at it from a different point of view. So I recommend this one, and just a good one to in a business sense, in a psychology sense. If you're an economics student, you would find it interesting. Just a lot of applications in a variety of fields. Yeah,
I mean, I completely agree with that, with some of the caveats that I've already put in throughout the episode. I don't think that that some of the limitations, particularly in that central section, diminish the value of the book. I think this is one of the most valuable books that's been published in the last 10 or so years. It's one that I think would be very good to have assigned to every college student or high school student. I would prefer a high school student, but it will take some time for most people, and it's worth spending that time and drinking in a little bit. So yeah, it's. I recommend it. I think it's important to read it and to acknowledge that in some way, shape, or form, we all do process the way that he talks about, and learning to understand how we process things can hopefully help us lead us to making better decisions and thinking more critically and clearly, which is something that only can lead to good outcomes, I think, both personally and in terms of society at large.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. That'll do it for us today. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being here with us. And next week, we will probably be discussing one of the ones I've just read, which will either be Creativity Inc. or What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. So one of those two. And if you enjoyed what you heard today, we'd appreciate a review on Apple Podcasts. It's probably the best place you can do it. And please share us on the Twitters and the Instagrams, and you can find us at all those places at Books of Titans, as well as booksoftitans.com. So on behalf of Jason Staples, I'm Eric Rostad. Thanks for listening.
Keep listening, keep reading, and keep improving.
And keep thinking.
Oh,
fast or slow.
Fast or slow. I made this.